Thanks for having us, Elle, so we could talk about these social housing wins that we've had here in Seattle. I'm Tiffany McCoy. I use she, her pronouns. And yes, I'm here in Seattle. I'm the co-executive director of House Our Neighbors. House Our Neighbors actually started about 5 years ago as a coalition in opposition to a charter amendment that would have really codified sweeps, the violent removal of our unhoused neighbors from one point to the other without shelter, without services. We created this coalition to fight against that. And then once we were successful in getting that charter amendment pushed by the largest businesses in our city, we wanted to go on the offensive. We wanted to put forward our vision of what it would look like if we could actually provide housing that's affordable at scale. And that's where social housing came in. And we've run two campaigns, two initiatives. We've taxed the wealthiest businesses to fund social housing, and looking forward to chatting about those.
Yes, this tax on companies in Seattle is super fascinating to me. I know you came at it from the social housing perspective. So how did you wind up basically advocating for a proposition that would tax exorbitant executive pay in Seattle?
Yeah, so I need to start with the first initiative, which created a Seattle social housing developer. And just for folks to know how we define social housing in the city of Seattle is housing that is publicly owned in perpetuity, it's permanently affordable, it's free of market speculation, and it's available to all. It's not means tested to the lowest common denominator. We set out to create this housing developer and this housing model, and we wanted to fund it with a progressive revenue source, but we weren't able to do that in the first initiative, ballot measure. They're called different things in different states. So we always knew that this was going to be a two-part process. We were going to create a social housing developer, which has really great governance, which maybe we'll get into. It's going to be resident majority on the governing board of our people's developer. Um, and so we wanted to create the vision and the structure, get that board up and running, get them hiring staff while we went out for a second ballot initiative to fund the social housing developer. And we knew from the beginning it was going to be a progressive revenue source. In Washington State, where we are one of the most regressive tax states in the country. We are 49th. Right behind us is Florida. Nothing to be proud of. We overwhelmingly rely on sales tax and on property taxes to fund any of our goods. We have also tremendous wealth in this city, in this state. We have millionaires, we have billionaires, and they're not paying income taxes in to fund all of the social services that we need. So, also because it is not allowed to have an income tax in our state, we needed to be creative. So we had a legislation passed at the city level a couple of years before Proposition 1A that taxed the largest businesses, but we wanted to build on that and specifically target the highest wage earners. And this would be an employer payroll tax. So we wanted to make sure that we were taxing the wealth in our city and that we were going after those who are the most able to pay. So what we passed in Proposition 1A was an excess compensation payroll tax. So this is on the employer, not on the employee. The employees do not pay this. And it is for any compensation over $1 million a year. The city is now taxing that 5%, and that 5% goes to the Seattle social housing developer to own, acquire, maintain social housing in the city. So what we mean by compensation is total compensation: stocks, bonds, deferred bonuses, just bonuses, benefits. There are all sorts of ways that businesses try to get around having to pay income tax or pay taxes. So we were able to make sure to capture all of that excess compensation in one go. And because we knew that payroll taxes so far are deemed legal in our state, we wanted to go with a payroll tax as well for this.
That is fascinating. So it started as an initiative to fund social housing, but then you end up doing it progressively by taxing excess pay of like $1 million, taxing the corporations on a payroll tax. That is fascinating. And I can see there was some opposition. Obviously, there's a lot of wealth in your state. It looks like Amazon, Microsoft, and T-Mobile fought to contest it, among others. How did you handle the opposition as this was rolling out? You had to get petitions first
Yes.
and then get the ballot measure, correct?
Yep. We had to
Okay.
file the initiative, get it approved by our city clerk, go out and gather 27,000 valid signatures. You always need to go above that for duplicates or people who have moved, renters. And so we turned in 38,000 signatures. And we really technically qualified for the November ballot, but because our city council had just been kind of overtaken by folks that were backed by the biggest businesses, they did some shady stuff and pushed us to a February special election. We were not deterred. We had just won our first initiative, I-135, in a special election. We knew that we could get people to turn out. The housing crisis is that bad. So we were also prepared when we ran this initiative to fund the social housing developer. We were prepared for the largest businesses to fight back. We were prepared for the mayor, Harold, to fight back, and the city council. But we know from talking to voters for the past 2.5 years before we launched Proposition 1A that people are hungry and desiring bold policy choices. So we were prepared for it. We had an incredible comms team. We didn't do any consultants. We didn't pay comms consultants. We are very homegrown in that way. And we just made sure to stay positive, visionary. We can have nice things if we tax those who have the most wealth and then enact them at the local level. While also, once the attacks started coming in from the largest businesses, not missing an opportunity to call out how they do not want to have social housing that will actually address the housing crisis at scale. So happy to get into a couple of those specific examples. But yeah, we definitely capitalized on Amazon and Microsoft. These businesses, these corporations, these CEOs who were standing behind Trump at his inauguration. We did not shy away from tying those individuals to this Trump regime and making sure that folks know that these oligarchs do not want you in Seattle to have housing.
Yeah, I see a message from Kumar. He says, "How did you connect to people in Seattle in the 2 years leading up to the initiative?" Like, I think that's a good question because you only did the petition, started the petition last year or
In 2024 is when we started
2024?
the
And then
Proposition
was on
1A.
the ballot in February this year, right? Okay.
Yes.
So
Yes.
yeah, yeah. Were people following your organization first? Okay.
Yes. So, like I said, we started as a coalition in April 2021 against a charter amendment. And then in January 2022, we launched Initiative 135, which would create a social housing developer in the city of Seattle that was going to be resident majority governing and all of these other really great aspects of it. It was going to provide housing for the first time that was permanently affordable, publicly owned in perpetuity, available to all, and free from market speculation. So not there to extract profit off of one of your most basic human needs. So we're talking to voters throughout that whole time. We passed that initiative, did the signature gathering, won it, and then we decided actually to form our coalition as a nonprofit. Not because we necessarily need more nonprofits in the world, but because we know from looking at movements internationally, if you don't have a political force that is there to be watchdogging, bird dogging, and to hold people accountable, those movements really die. If you look at what happened in Berlin and other European countries after the fall of the Soviet Empire, they sold off massive swaths of their social housing stock, of their publicly owned housing stock to their detriment. Now they're trying to buy a lot of that back, get that land back. But if you look to places like Vienna and Singapore that prioritize these, that is the way that we want to move in this city. And I think that we've captured a lot of hearts, a lot of minds, and people are inspired. And as Elle and I were talking about at the beginning, people need places to feel inspired and that they can make a difference. So it is just a continuum of like 4.5, 5 years of organizing.
Well, that's so cool. Okay, so you got all your signatures, you got on the ballot, and then people voted for it. But I understand they had to vote for two. It was a kind of two-part proposition, right? Will you explain how that worked?
Yeah, so technically, when we filed the excess compensation payroll tax, also known as the social housing payroll tax, it was actually called Initiative 137. That's what we gathered the signatures under. That's what we were planning to run the initiative under. But because in the city of Seattle, in the state of Washington, City Council, the legislative body, has a opportunity to do three things when a citizen's initiative is brought to their desk. One is to pass the initiative as is. There was no chance that they were going to do that. The second is to just put it on the ballot. And the third is that they can put on an alternative. So they put something that is competing with the citizens initiative on the ballot for the voters to decide. So that is when I-137 that we launched became Proposition 1A. And then the city and the wealthiest businesses and Mayor Harrell's alternative became Proposition 1B. So now we had to educate all of our people about 137 becoming Prop 1A and differentiate between obvious desires to make them seem pretty much the same, but that the city council alternative was more smart, the better way, the better governance way. But once we started seeing those big hitters come out and fund the opposition, once we recognized that the money from the alternative that the city council put forward actually took money away from affordable housing developers to give to the social housing developer, and the fact that the alternative by the council and the mayor would not have funded the model of social housing that voters already passed. Voters passed housing from 0% of the area median income to 120%. The mayor and the city council alternative would have only allowed it to be exactly the kind of affordable housing as we're already doing. So making sure that we educated voters about that, that we were tying Amazon to the opposition a lot. Frankly, them paying as much as they did in the opposition was a gift to us.
I was gonna say, once you see like Amazon and Microsoft coming out being like, we don't want you to tax our salaries of
Yeah,
$1 million or more, you're like, okay, well, I kind of want to.
yeah, yeah,
I think that's I think that's what's really fascinating. We had like some minor case studies leading up to this. Like I know Portland already has a kind of version of this, and then San Francisco passed one in I believe 2020 that is similar. And then you guys passed this year. So there is this kind of we can see that there's this movement that are like, okay, in Seattle and San Francisco, the places that have some of the biggest tech companies in our
mhm,
country and everybody there, there's so many tech workers there, and the citizens still vote to tax excess pay. I think that's really, really saying something. Did you
yes.
feel like there was like there was like hype and momentum behind that?
Yes, there was hype and momentum around social housing. Also, just the picture that we painted of what it could look like, to where you don't have Black and brown communities continually being displaced out of their historic neighborhoods, to where you don't have low wage workers driving 30 to 60 minutes each way just to work in the city of Seattle and then go home and maybe have some time to themselves and their families. Also, we're seeing like massive enrollment drops in our public school system. And the data continues to show that it is because one of the reasons, there are multiple, but one is the high cost of housing here. You can't afford to build a family in here. You can't find multifamily housing in the city of Seattle. So yes, there was a lot of hope and vision that was brought forward. People knew we were going to come back with this tax. And then the fact that, again, we stuck to our word. We weren't going to try to take away from the small pie of affordable housing. And the fact that we have so much wealth in the city that we can tax that to fund a social housing. And just to like give a snapshot of how much wealth is untapped in the city, we are taxing only 5% of total compensation over a million. So the first million is free. No taxes on that for social housing. And we estimated that that would bring in roughly 50 million a year. The city just put out estimates that that will bring in roughly 30 million to 80 million in just 1 year. Like that is how much wealth is concentrated. And for folks that are like really worried about, businesses leaving, we had a whole slew of answers to that too, just to show how totally vacuous that argument is. And one other thing just to highlight, Elle, we're really lucky in Seattle because we have tech workers that have started an organization years ago called Tech for Housing. And so it is tech workers who want this city to be livable for everyone, not just tech workers. And they organize and they donate, they redistribute their wealth back to movements, and they go out and they knock doors, they gather signatures, they show up. So we also have that tech sector that is like, tax us more, tax our bosses more, make sure that the city is a livable place for everyone.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I'd imagine everyone, even if you're not unhoused, being able to see to struggle to find a place to live in Seattle as just a normal tech worker too. I think that you can't deny what extreme wealth does to a location for everybody else that lives there, even though they're the minority of people that live there. So that makes a lot of sense. I think I think what's interesting too about these kind of taxes is that the company doesn't have to pay for them. They could they could they could pay their executives less and theoretically pay their workers more because they have more compensation to give to everyone else, which would also help housing in the area.
Mhm.
So it's
Mhm.
kind of like a double whammy in that it incentivizes the structures that you want, and if they don't change it, you're still getting the social housing in the area. That's
Yeah.
seems like a win-win.
Yes. Yes. You would think so, but again, at the end of the day, we know that their motive overwhelmingly is greed, and that is also just built into the economic model of corporations under capitalism, right?
Yeah, totally. I see a comment from Camillo clarifying. So the 5% over $1 million is for social housing, but there's a payroll expense tax that applies for other things. That's correct, right?
Yep.
It's an additional tax you're adding.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Let me make sure I didn't add. Kumar asked, "What if both 1A and 1B passed? Is that possible?"
No, that would not be possible. Only one can pass. So there were actually three questions. One was, should the social housing developer be funded? Yes or no? And two-thirds of voters said yes. And then when you got down into how should it be funded, should it be the excess compensation payroll tax or should it be the council's alternative? And we won by a 26-point margin, 1A won. So even with like the chamber and the biggest, wealthiest businesses dropping $850,000, I think a bit more, but $850,000 in a 25-day period. They waited until the very end in mail in vote states. This is what they do. They don't do any groundwork until the very end because they're polling, they're doing focus groups, they're spending a lot of money coming up with their comms, which are pretty divorced from actual reality and people, and then they drop a crap ton of money at the end. But we just kept watching the money come in. And then once Amazon donated money, we're like, it's time because people in Seattle hate when Amazon throws its weight around financially in elections. So we made sure to plaster one of our lefty local news media sources, the Stranger, and also the Seattle Times with banners, digital banners that showed like really happy people rallying together for housing, but also don't let Amazon stop social housing.
Is that the tagline you used?
Once they donated, yes, like I said, it was a gift. It was
That's
so
good.
great for them to do that.
That's a killer headline. I can see that doing well.
Mhm.
Okay, so how did you raise awareness? Was it a lot of advertising? How did you get everyone to know about this? It's so hard, even as a voter and somebody who tries to really read up on everything on my ballot. It is so hard to know what you're voting on and that you're voting on the right thing. So how did you handle education?
The really weirdly beautiful thing about off year elections and special elections is that you're oftentimes the only thing on the ballot. So during I-135, we were the only thing on the ballot. So the nice thing too then is like all of the media coming up to that election is around you. Because there's nothing else competing. It's not like you're dealing with state races, local races, state initiatives. It's just you. And like people need winter news to cover at the local level. I would say that was the same for this year or last February as well. Because there was only one other proposition on the ballot. But we take a lot of pride in our grassroots outreach and approach. So it is doing signature gathering at farmers markets, outside of grocery stores, at festivals. Talking with a lot of people had already heard and remembered that we were going to come back to them for another initiative, and then having them recognize we kept our promises. It was going to be progressive. We weren't going to go after affordable housing money. Like that just builds integrity. We also just, like I said, have a communications work group, and that is just open to any volunteer, any endorsing organization. And in those meetings every other week, we come up with our comm strategy. What are folks hearing in the field? How do we adapt to that in our external communications? What does our flyer look like? What does our digital ads look like? Are we going to do mailers? How do we respond to all of this money being dumped in at the end? Like we have a lot of stock in focusing on voters, but also in making sure that we're doing op-eds, earned media. When Amazon started dumping in money, we held a press conference outside of the Amazon Balls in downtown Seattle to call attention to them trying to throw their weight around. We called attention to the fact that John Scholes, the head of the Downtown Seattle Association, said, quote, to the city council when advocating for the alternative, said, quote, while you don't have the opportunity or option to stop it, I-137, in its tracks, you do have an opportunity to provide a reasonable and more responsible alternative, end quote. So this is the town sale association saying you can't stop it, unfortunately. So try to mess it up in a different way. So just really focusing on all this, but not just going out there and being kind of like pitchforking, if that makes sense, Elle. Like,
Yeah.
you're not just going out there and like, oh, I hate Amazon, oh, I hate Microsoft, but it's like bringing that into like focus and like, this is what we're trying to achieve with this. We're not just taxing these individuals to tax them. We have a vision for where this money is going to go and showing people what it could create and then tying it to international examples of social housing that have made a fundamental change and shift in how people are housed in their cities and their states.
Yeah, I do want to talk about your unique social housing model because this is different from like your typical affordable housing models that you see other places, right? Will you explain the difference?
Yes. So to be super clear from the get go, we need both. We need affordable housing and we need social housing. But what I came from working with folks that are unhoused and seeing the long lines for shelter, seeing the long lines for Section 8 vouchers, and also just frankly, a lot of unhoused folks that I knew not wanting to only live in income segregated housing. They wanted to live in nice housing that wasn't just in this low opportunity zone of the city. They want to be able to be socially cohesive in the city and not just be relegated to, the poorer areas. But if we zoom back and look at how we provide affordable housing in this country, it is overwhelmingly reliant on the federal government through the Housing and Urban Development Department. And we are at their behest. How many Section 8 vouchers are they going to give a year? How much are they going to give in a tax credit? And how much are they going to put aside in project-based vouchers and other incentives? And at the end of the day, it's wholly inadequate. Unfortunately, none of our elected officials talk to the public frankly that like they don't have a plan. There's no plan at any level of government to address the housing affordability scale at crisis. And once our housing affordability crisis at scale, and once we realize once you start talking about it openly, that's not something to be afraid of. That's something to be curious about because now you can start looking for what other tools do we need to bring in to actually make housing affordable without continuing to pump public dollars into the private market to incentivize them. And that's where we look at Singapore, Vienna, community land trusts, Finland, Toronto, New Zealand, all of these other places that provide social housing as a public benefit, not as a private asset. And you can build really strong campaigns around those issues because people know at the end of the day that they don't have a lot longer to live in this city before they either need to double up, triple up, quadruple up in their rental or are completely priced out of the city as a whole.
So explain the difference between a public benefit and a private benefit in terms of social housing.
So social housing, we see it as a public good. It's public infrastructure. Just like you have public schools, we have public libraries. I have a kid, she goes to Seattle Public Schools. I am not means tested out of that. It's not like, oh, you make over X amount of money. Sorry, you need to go compete now on the private market for schools. These are universal benefits that we need to be expanding on. And that's what we see social housing as. We do not have that currently in our affordable housing sector. It is income restricted. And there are benefits to that. There are some incredibly low income folks that need deeply subsidized housing. We just believe that we can also have another element of housing, social housing, where people don't have to just go and compete on the private market for their most basic human need. Just like the fact that we as a society think it's acceptable to put our most basic human need, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, into the hands of the for-profit market is insane. And we should just recognize that and agree to that. And then why do we not provide why do we provide schools? And don't get me wrong, there are lots of ways we could do better with these public goods, but why don't we also provide housing as a public good that can directly compete with the private market and cool rents and actually provide a better benefit and stability and neighborhoods and community cohesion and reduction of mental illness. I mean, I could go on and on about the benefits of social housing.
Okay, that's awesome. I want to know how you decided that. I know you were looking for a progressive tax that would fund this. How did you decide on we're going to tax executive pay at $1 million and over? Like, what is it that made you decide that particular metric?
To be honest, we just don't have a lot of tools in Washington state. We don't. Like I said, we overly rely on sales tax and property taxes. We've seen individuals need to move out of the city or even the state because property taxes are increasing more than their income restricted nature, or they're retired and they're not going to get, more money from Social Security. Um, but we wanted to make sure it was progressive, again, because we're the 49th most regressive state for taxation in the country. But we don't have a lot of options. We couldn't do a progressive income because we cannot have income taxes in the state of Washington. Property needs to be taxed equally. We looked at some other potentialities, jet fuel, private jet fuel, mortgage, yacht mortgage, um, but none of those were going to bring in the dollar amounts that we wanted. We didn't want this to be like a pilot, the social housing experiment. We wanted to actually show significant results annually. So that's where it came into, like, we have a crap ton of money that's not taxed in the city. Let's do a payroll tax, which has already gone through the Court of Appeals and been deemed legal because it is taxing the services that those companies are paying their employees. And so we decided to just go above $1 million in total compensation and run on that, because we knew people would also really support that because it's not taxing them and there's no way for the company to put that onto the employee to play.
How many people do you know how many people in Seattle, or like what percentage of the population earns more than $1 million?
We, because private companies have such a lot of privacy,
Yeah.
which, they don't want us to have, but they have a lot of privacy. No, those are not like public records. We just know from our current Jumpstart payroll tax roughly how much is brought in with that, but the threshold is a lot lower. So it was some really great policy people crunching the numbers. They did two different sets, and that's how we came to 5% of an excess compensation payroll tax. We just wanted to make sure it was a good chunk of money, because then in the future, this public development authority, the social housing developer, can bond, and it can bond on that guaranteed revenue. And that will just like accelerate the production and acquisition of social housing.
Interesting. Yeah. I think this is I haven't landed on like what the ideal way is. I imagine it's different for every city. But the interesting thing is San Francisco's tax, for example, is on companies that pay executives 100 times more than the median worker. So it's like based on the ratio,
Mhm.
rather than the dollar amount. And I know why you would want to do that, because you're like, well, that rate, you could raise the lower ratio as well. Like it just doesn't necessarily mean like reduce the top, but raise the bottom, which I
Yeah.
think is a really important societal effect. It also has the benefit that as inflation and dollars lose value, that you're not tied to a specific dollar amount later on. Do you think that there could be um, how are you feeling about this tax now? Like, do you think that it has longevity, that number 1 million is like the threshold that you always need to be at, or how are you thinking about that?
We also, when we were drafting the Proposition 1A, we set it at $1 million in total compensation, period. We did not tie it to inflation. So even in 10 years, even though $1 million in 10 years is going to be different than 1 million now, it's still $1 million. It's still more than the vast majority of Seattleites will ever experience. So we didn't want to tie that to inflation because we want to tax the wealthiest businesses. And again, because these are businesses, these aren't individuals that we are taxing. So we couldn't necessarily do the ratio. I mean, it's such great comms. It's such great imagery, but that was going to be tricky territory for us because it was about actually going after individuals as opposed to the company
Mhm.
employer payroll tax. So we needed to be creative in our legal laws here, and that's where we just like excess compensation. I think everyone can agree if you're making over $1 million a year, that's excess, and that excess compensation that your employer has the ability to pay should go into funding housing as a public good.
Yeah, that's interesting. I see some critique maybe of social housing overall from Camillo. He's kind of making the argument that is social housing doomed to fail if Seattle follows through with proposed zoning laws, low density housing for a city of that size, etc. Um, I I I think this is kind of an interesting point, but maybe not a contradictory one. I think that my own personal take is that yes, if we can reduce zoning regulations and make it a bunch of private housing to like build tons and tons of buildings and micro units and get lots of housing in, housing prices will go down because there is less demand and more supply. I feel like that's a no-brainer thing that we need to do, but that doesn't necessarily eradicate the need also for social housing. I'm guessing that's similar to your take, or you have a take there.
Yeah, totally. Like those two things are non-competition, and in fact, they're both needed in order for social housing to succeed. And we've said this from also day one. We need social housing and we need to end exclusionary zoning. We, though, at Housing Our Neighbors, do not believe that just ending exclusionary zoning is in the long term going to reduce rents to the level that families can stay here. I know that there are studies in Austin and other areas, but I would say that the jury is still out on the longitudinal study of that. We're talking about the 30, 40, 50 years. And if you have those studies, please do send them to me. I'm happy to be corrected on that. But regardless, at the end of the day, we do not believe that the private market is set up to succeed for folks in the working class. What we're seeing right now, too, we have an overproliferation of studios and one bedrooms by the private sector here in Seattle. They're not incentivized to build family size units. So you have this housing market right now where the affordable housing sector isn't creating 2, 3, 4 bedroom units because they don't have enough financing from the federal government to make that happen. And then you have the private sector where it's not profitable enough for them to make 2, 3, 4 bedroom units. You need a public sector developer to go in and build those family size units because that is what the public that you're serving needs. That's one example. The second example is we want to make sure that folks of all income brackets are able to go and live and send their kids to school in those high opportunity zones. And that is not just a guarantee if you end exclusionary zoning, that people that are lower income, lower middle income are going to be able to afford housing in those areas. We should not be segregating our neighborhoods based on their income. So we are actually in the middle of our land use update here in the city of Seattle. We're pushing for upzoning. We're pushing for the end of exclusionary zoning. We know in cities like Vienna that you also have the private sector that plays a really important part. We want as many tools to be deployed now to lower rents for individuals. But at the end of the day, unless you have a developer that is there to provide housing as a public good and to provide high quality housing, um, we cannot leave that to the hands of the private sector. At the end of the day, their job is to make profit, not to provide housing as a public good. So that is the only thing I would kind of take issue with.
That makes sense. I can also imagine too, if we actually end all these zoning regulations that are prohibiting housing development, I imagine that, like, say that all went away tomorrow and we suddenly have an influx of affordable housing, everybody can get rent for $300 a month in a city, then yeah, maybe that will reduce the need for social housing, but we're not there right now. So until that happens, there's always going to be a need for these
Hmm.
for social helping for social housing until we reach utopia.
Right, right.
Okay, so um, this is this is really cool what you did. Do you think that other cities could do this as well or copy your model?
I do. I think it is totally dependent upon their state and how big their coalition is. I mean, to be honest, like we have staff at our nonprofits that are campaign workers. You have myself, you have other staff. Like it is our nonprofit that is paying to fund these campaigns and to staff them and to build out these coalitions. And then you have other nonprofits and organizations and unions that are giving some of their staff time to these efforts. So if you find that, yes, absolutely. But every state is different in its taxation policy. So I know, like in Massachusetts, they have that millionaire's tax because they can do an income tax. I know in LA, United to House LA passed this incredible real estate excise tax on real estate transactions over 5 million. Like we as a country do not tax the wealthiest at the level that should in order for that money to go back into the public coffers. So that's why we see declining enrollment in schools. We see declining schools. We just see folks that are not able to afford to live in the cities in which they work. And you see like folks retirement, owning a home, like these things are completely out of reach. So I do think it's replicable. I think right now is a really great time to have these campaigns because people want outlets for hope. They want outlets for radical love and organizing that is going to create an environment that can stand up against the Trump regime and fascism, and cuts to, we're talking about housing too, cuts to the Housing and Urban Development Department. We're talking existential cuts that are going to hurt our neighbors, especially our neighbors that are really low income and unhoused. So it's just about getting a lawyer, getting a coalition, finding your messaging, and just working together to fight for a future that we all know that we need. And just that, unfortunately, a lot of those in elected office are not helping us to get.
Mm. I'd imagine too that a lot of different organizations could implement a similar kind of tax to fund whatever initiative that city might need. Not all cities might need social housing as much as others, and might do a similar executive compensation tax on something else that that city needs.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
I, I I see James mentioned in Washington, you've already kind of got this figured out what tax laws work. Could cities like Tacoma, Everett, and Bellevue then just copy that model and do the same thing?
Yes, those places could, and we've talked to all of those cities except for one who are interested in replicating this model. There are of course like very real differences between the concentration of tech and wealth in Seattle versus Tacoma or Bellingham. Um, But Spokane, I mean, these things are growing, like the tech sector, AI, these are growing. It's also wealth management, it's private equity, it's other types of big businesses that were also, it's not just tech, it is any wealthy business that is able to pay someone over $1 million. You could lower that threshold in Washington state. You could lower it to 250,000. You could lower it to 200,000. It's just deciding with policy and economics people how much money you're trying to bring in for your program or your policy, and how much you need to tax in order for that to be funded. And I will say that when you are going after progressive revenue, having something that is funding is critical, because you don't just want to pass a tax and then have it go into the general fund, which can overwhelmingly go into things that maybe we in this room do not agree with. But when you tie it to something, people feel a lot more empowered and wanting to fight, wanting to spend their weekends door knocking in the sleet and the hail or the sun and the rain.
Yeah, it's this particular one is very interesting because it strikes me that this is a sneaky alternative to tax the rich, because your traditional tax the rich structure is everybody earns their money, and then after the fact we tax the highest wealth brackets the most or whatever to get those funds. But you could imagine some kind of reverberations from that. For example, companies then paying their executives even more to compensate for the loss that they'll have on the taxation end, or to pay more of their compensation in stock, which isn't taxed the same way as income, things like that. But in this case, you're taxing the corporation, and you're saying the company, if they pay anybody more than $1 million, they're paying a tax of 5% on that excess. So that actually makes it in the company's interest to pay people less or to pay the tax and build that into their
Hmm.
strategy. But that strikes me as a policy that benefits everybody and that will incentivize behavior we want to incentivize. Um, did you kind of know that going into it? Is that what you were trying to achieve? I know your input was like trying to solve social housing and fund social housing, but this side benefit of taking this tax money to do it is a very interesting alternative to other sources of wealth and inequality taxation.
Yeah. And when you just, I mean, we have something in Seattle called the Puget Sound Business Journal. I'm sure that other states have a business journal. I'm going to venture that guess. You just open that up and you read it, and you just see all of these new tech companies that are startups that are already making a lot of money and then moving into these areas. You see Meta and Apple renovating their offices, like they're not strapped for cash. And then you see, which was one of our favorite examples to point out during this initiative fight, was the new CEO of Starbucks, Nickel, who was being paid to fly on a private jet 3 times a week. And if you calculated out the how much it costs in jet fuel and time, like it's pretty comparable to what the Prop 1A tax would be just for Nichols' overall compensation package. And when you just show that to voters, like this is a rounding error for Starbucks. This tax, like this is a rounding error for Amazon. Like they are throwing their wealth around in front of us, like with this pay. Like I think Nickel made $96 million in total compensation in just 4 months. Like, this is outrageous, egregious.
Well,
And
they're
when you have
closing stores and
yes,
their
oh yeah, yeah,
employees
yeah.
are trying to unionize.
Mhm. Yeah, so just pointing these things out, kinda letting folks draw their own conclusion, but just putting facts in front of them, pointing out, "This seems a bit unequal," right? Like, and then helping them if they're open and receptive, otherwise just leaving them there with that fact, and if that's through an op-ed, if that's through a mailer, if that's through a door knocking or a conversation at a farmer's market, just being attuned to the voter and what is gonna get them to see, "Yeah, I should vote yes for Prop 1A."
If you if there's people on this call who work for organizations or founded organizations that are grassroots in their own cities and they're implementing or they're interested in implementing a similar excess compensation tax, what would you say? Like, give me the things you learned the hard way, that you're like, if I had it to do over, we would need to do this, or this is the thing that you need to do the most. What did you learn from this process?
Well, I would first say that folks should feel free to reach out. My email is on Substack. Like, we weekly talk to groups around the country about social housing and or this tax. So that's why we also have an organization, is to be able to like share out this knowledge and these lessons that we've learned. So please reach out. Would love to chat. We've talked to council members, state legislators, and grassroots groups. But overall, and I was just in Oregon talking at their Housing Oregon conference, and I know they're trying to do another progressive revenue source to fund affordable housing. But unfortunately, some folks are thinking like you need to do polling, you need consultants, you need all of these like uh, heavy investments before you even entertain the idea. And I would just say, to fight back against that idea, really truly just do. Like, we didn't poll in either of one of our initiatives, and we won overwhelmingly. And we knew that we were going to do that because yes, it's about winning, but it's also just about putting out things that we think are right. Like, what is morally right as opposed to what's politically possible. And then second is just because like people are hurting everywhere, all over the place, and they want bold vision to like get organized by, get educated by, and plug into. So you do need to find a coalition. Don't go at it yourself. Try to tap into labor unions. Try to tap into educators. I mean, school employees can't afford to live in the city that they're teaching kids. Teaching our next generation. Bus drivers aren't able to afford to live in the city that they work. Nurses, our first responders can't afford. Architects. Just start talking with folks. Plug into groups that are already maybe doing some of this work, but just I would say be bold and go forward, and just know that really it's the public that's going to be your best barometer on what's possible when you get out there and start talking to them.
It's a really good marker that Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco have already succeeded at this for other initiatives, especially because you do have some of the biggest companies. So I think that I can only imagine it working in other cities as well. All our companies are in cities. So I feel like this is a highly replicable model. What do you think about, opposition efforts saying the companies will just move?
Yeah, so we were totally prepared from that before we even started drafting. So we did lots of research and studies on how to talk about revenue, how to talk about taxes, how to talk about taxation, what words to use, what not. Like, we say wealthiest businesses, we don't say richest businesses. We do that for a reason. There's also this really great book. It's dated, but it's called The Myth of Millionaire Tax Flight. And it's one of the biggest longitudinal studies over multiple states that have enacted different progressive policies and whether or not folks leave. Of course, people are going to decide and they're going to vote with their feet. Jeff Bezos, yes, moved out of Washington state. That doesn't mean that he doesn't still have really high paid workers here in this city and in this state that can provide more money to fund our basic public goods. So we were just prepared for that, did lots of research. And then it is reading that business journal. And every time this is brought up, it's bringing up all of the companies that are actually renovating, bringing up the companies of the week that are now moving here, and then bringing it always back to the fact that, like, the idea that a wealthiest business is just going to pick up and move is completely antithetical to the business model. The business model is predicated on insider knowledge. It is predicated on the relationships that those executives have. They're giving up home field advantage if they decide to move everything abroad or into another place because they don't want to pay a rounding error of a tax for housing. Yes, some are going to do that, but overwhelmingly, they're going to be taking a huge hit in their business if they do that. And it's just bringing it back to those talking points. Like this idea that they're just going to leave is a myth. And there's been tremendous investment in these companies as well. And where else in this country are you going to go and find a plethora of tech workers like you have in Seattle? There are places, but you're not going to find it at the same level.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Um, all right, so this is interesting. Your ballot initiative passed this year. Have you already started taxing?
Yes, the city is responsible for taxing, so they've started doing all the outreach, creating all the Seattle municipal codes, and then they're collecting all of that by the end of quarter 4, and then we'll start paying that out to the social housing developer in quarter 1, and then they can start acquisition and new construction.
Okay, so what is the plan? What are you going to do with that money as it comes in 2026?
Yeah, so I'm with House Our Neighbors, which is just advocacy arm, education. We ran the two initiatives. We are not the social housing developer. We created that through an initiative, but we are still here to make sure that they're doing what the voters enacted, that they're following their charter. We're also here to make sure that the city doesn't try to screw with this, to be polite, because we have seen already some ways that they are trying to do that, not guaranteeing payments or not paying things that they've already were supposed to do. So that is our role, and people now look to us for that guidance and that leadership. But with that money, the developer is going to start acquisitions. So this isn't ground up in construction, not yet, but it is taking buildings out of the private sector into the public sector, filling those with renters or keeping the residents that are currently there, and then starting to build up a portfolio and rental income that can also show that this is a non-risky investment in the bond market in the next 5 to 6 years. So to starting to create social housing residences, building up that social housing portfolio. And yeah, the money can be used for maintenance, staff, acquisitions, and new construction. I also know there are lots of groups that are reaching out that have land or surplus land or land from churches that want to sell to the social housing developers. So there's a lot of opportunity, I'll say.
And what's the grand vision? Wasn't it something like 20,000 units or something like what was the total? I
Right
forget.
now with the $50 million a year, that's estimated to do like 300. Actually, the Seattle Social Housing Developer estimated, I believe, 500 units a year with that.
A year, yeah, over the
But
next
then
10
when
years
you
or
start getting
something.
into the bonding, we're talking a lot more than that. And then if you're able to get land donated for free, which the city and the state have the opportunity to do, it's going to be a constantly accelerating process. And it's something that we desperately need and we needed 20, 30 years ago.
That's really impressive. Very cool. Okay, so now you've got the income coming in as of Q4, and you're going to start the building process and making sure that social housing is funded by excessive executive pay. I love
Mhm.
it. This is amazing.
Yes.
Do you have any final takeaways you think it's important for us to know about the process or for replicating it in other cities?
Don't forget to have fun when you're running these campaigns. Like, be cheeky, but also just like be positive and visionary. People are really desperate for things to hope for right now, and give them hope, but make sure that you fulfill that promise of hope. Something that I'll just say if folks are really interested in doing grassroots campaigns that I'm still shocked has the cachet that it does, but we have a mascot actually that's called Housey. And it is, one of our steering committee members wears this. We took it out signature gathering. We took it out on election night. It is a staple. And now we have like housey stickers. We have enamel pins, and everyone knows that when there's that house out there in the world, that is social housing. So like, have fun. Be positive and visionary. Find people that want to fight for a better world with you. Don't get bogged down into the bureaucracy of needing to get consultants or do polling. I'm not saying those things aren't helpful. Please don't get me wrong. It's just we wanted to do things a bit differently, and we live in a place that is quite progressive. I don't want any listener to be like, "Oh, but that's Seattle." You're not even talking about the rest of the country. Yes, and we're in such a time at the federal level where I think that there is a lot of opportunity right now for these things to happen at the local level because of all of the existential cuts that are coming to us. SNAP, Medicaid, Medicare, schools, health or student loans. I mean, who knows? Like, start investing at the local level and running these campaigns to do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's also worth pointing out too that I mean, I live in Utah, it's a red state, but Salt Lake City is progressive. Most cities are progressive, so this is like a very salient place where we can like get an in
Yes.
into the system. That's also where the companies are. So
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of opportunity here. Um,
Yes. We have talked to
cool.
folks in Salt Lake City about social housing, actually.
You have? Who have you
Yeah,
talked to?
some folks in the city. Yeah.
At the city government?
LA, like legislative aides.
Oh, legislative.
Mhm.
Okay. I will look into that because I want to talk to them about this. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for participating. It was such a joy to get to talk to you and learn more about your initiative. You're really pioneering something here that I think could be a really big solve in our country. So I really appreciate you telling us more about it.
Thanks for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk about it and social housing. And for everyone that tuned in, yeah, just like don't give up. Don't give up hope and don't give up the belief that we can have really nice things if we fight for them.
We can have nice things. I
Yeah.
like it. All right. Well, thanks so much. And I will post the recording in the next couple of days for everyone listening. See you online.
Bye.